Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to hop on, and then we'll get started in just another 2 or 3 minutes. If you're just joining us, welcome to the tipping point when youth use becomes addiction. We're going to get started in just a minute. Okay, I think we're going to get started just because we have a pretty packed agenda. So I just want to introduce myself. My name is Nina Levine. I'm the Associate Project Coordinator on the Drug Free Communities Grant for the town of Natick. I'm going to introduce some of the other collaborators tonight, but to start, we're going to have time for questions and answers following the presentations. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Throughout the presentation, feel free to drop any questions in there for any of the panelists. And towards the end of the event, we're going to share a survey link in the chat. And tomorrow, you'll receive an email with that same link and some resources that we've put together for you. So the Natick 180 Coalition and the Substance Prevention Alliance of Needham, also known as SPAN, are proud to present The Tipping Point, when youth use becomes addiction. Thank you all for attending this event. We are recording the event, so you'll receive a link to replay the entire event in your email tomorrow. And we're really excited to hear from Michelle Lipinski, Maureen Kavanaugh, and Cody Desmond. But before we get started, I just want to introduce some of the colleagues from Natick and Needham. So we have Katie Sugarman, the Prevention and Outreach Program Manager and the DFC Program Director for the Natick Health Department. Astrid Dretler, the Administrative Project Coordinator for the Natick Health Department and staff on the Natick 180 Coalition. We have Karen Shannon, the Senior Substance Use Prevention Program Coordinator for the town of Needham. Monica DeWinter and Karen Mullen are the project coordinators for the town of Needham, and Angie McDonald is the Vaping Grant Coordinator for the town of Needham. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll have the opportunity to hear more about them and their experiences. So Michelle Lipinski is the principal of North Shore Recovery High School. As a recovery advocate, Michelle's mission is to address addiction and the opioid epidemic locally and nationally. Michelle and her students from North Shore Recovery High School were recently featured on the MTV series 16 and Recovering. Maureen Kavanaugh is an author and founder of Magnolia New Beginnings, an organization that provides access to online support groups for anyone struggling with a loved one's addiction and provides access to recovery housing in Massachusetts. Maureen is the author of the memoir, If You Love Me, A Mother's Journey Through Her Daughter's Opioid Addiction. And Cody Desmond is a self-described person in long-term recovery after struggling with addiction since the age of 13. He graduated from North Shore Recovery High School in 2007. Cody currently serves as the program director and accreditation specialist at Aftermath, an outpatient treatment center in Wakefield, Massachusetts. We're excited to welcome the panelists here this evening. We're going to begin by showing a clip of the show 16 and Recovering, which premiered last year and showcases North Shore Recovery High School. Cody, you're muted.
All righty, there we go. That should be better. Thank you, Nina. I appreciate and thanks to both Natick 180 and the Substance Prevention Alliance of Needham for having an event on this extremely crucial topic and for having us be a part of this conversation. It warms my heart to know that people are discussing this topic and trying to come together to not only educate our community members, our parents, our peers, our educators, but to also make people aware that there are resources out there. Because when my addiction took off, when I was around 13 years old, no one was having this conversation, at least not out in the open. So just a quick backstory of myself. I was born and raised in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Growing up, I had not only had everything that I needed in life, I had everything that I wanted growing up. I played any sport that I wanted to. I had a great group of friends and family that I was always spending time with. I was the kid that would ride his bicycle up and down the street until the street light came on, and then I would return home for dinner and homework. I had a pretty close to a perfect childhood, at least on the surface. I also had some pretty traumatic experiences happen to me at a young age, and I think that's when my skill of burying my emotions started. But entering high school is when it all changed for me. My whole life, I was an honor student. I was a three-sport athlete. But along with being the star athlete or the class clown and having those titles that I thought would make me cool and popular, I was also a very emotional and sensitive young boy from a very young age. And being emotional or sensitive in high school, it's in my mind, it was a good way to lose friends. It was a good way to be labeled a geek or a nerd or be bullied. But me being afraid to show my emotions or my sensitive side didn't mean that it still didn't exist and that it still wasn't a part of who I am. I just tried everything in my power to hide it. So I found a way to medicate those feelings. And by doing that, my progression, my obsession with staying high, with numbing myself and not facing those feelings really kicked off. And I think from my public high school's point of view, it was simply a behavioral issue with me. I don't believe that my public high school was well equipped to be dealing with a student in the midst of developing a substance use disorder. I feel like at the time they didn't have the knowledge or the resources to deal with students in my position or the many other students that were in a similar position as me. The approach that they used to deal with us kids who were struggling was pure discipline. It was zero tolerance. It was being yelled at. It was detention, where we were thrown in a room by ourselves to think about what we have done. It was suspending us. It was sending us on what we called a vacation. It was using previous students as examples. Do you want to end up like so and so? Safe to say that my time at my public high school didn't last long. Within 3 months of me smoking pot for the first time, this three-sport athlete, this honor student, this nice man with a loving family, was expelled for not being able to sit in class without being high. I was told to clean up my locker, walk straight out the main doors, and to not step foot back on the grounds where the police would be called. From there, I bounced around to a local alternative school and to a boarding school in Maine. Safe to say that their approach was similar. It was all about discipline. It was all about zero tolerance. It was never about figuring out why the student was acting out and turning to drugs to cope with whatever they were going through and trying to address the underlying issue. It was about beating you down in submission until you changed your ways. And I think at this point, we can all agree that the zero tolerance or the war on drugs or the just say no campaigns probably did more harm than good because it neglected to get to the root of the issues, the why. So again, because of the lack of knowledge, the lack of support, the lack of understanding, I only lasted a few weeks at the alternative school, whose main purpose was to help kids with similar issues. And I lasted a whopping 4 hours at the boarding school in Maine before they told me very politely to never step foot on their campus again. Because I had had so much anxiety about going up there 4 or 5 hours away from home. I've never been away from home for that long. And I had smoked a joint and I got caught like I always did. And instead of trying to address or assist with that underlying crippling feeling of anxiety, they didn't even care to ask why I felt the need to smoke a joint. And they literally told me that I was a menace to society and that I was going nowhere in life. At this point was probably the first point that I started to feel helpless, that no one wanted or cared about me, that no one wanted me around, that everybody was cutting me off because I was just a terrible human being. But in all reality, what it was, I was a terrified, a sad, a lonely, angry, confused 14-year-old child who had felt abandoned by his hometown, by his school system, by his peers. And when I say that this next step in my journey drastically altered my trajectory in life, I mean that times 1,000. It was about a month or so of me not being in school because nobody wanted to deal with me. And my mother had woke me up and she had found a place for me to go. And when I tell you my anxiety and fear were at an all-time high that morning, that is no exaggeration, especially when my mother tells me that the school is called Recovery High School. I'm sorry, Michelle, but I immediately pictured the show Scared Straight, or that the classes would be held in jail cells, that there would be metal detectors, or it would be full of gang members that would jump me the second I walked into the building. And that could not have been farther from the truth, because I remember my first morning at Recovery High School very clearly. I walked with my parents into Michelle's office back in 2008. And I honestly thought that there was going to be a security guard in the office that would throw me down in the chair, handcuff me, and Michelle would begin the spiel about what I'm going to do, what I'm not going to do, or that I'm a terrible person who needs to get his life in order. I walked into that office. There was no security guard. There were no bars on the window, and there was no cuffs waiting for me. Michelle got up from behind her desk to greet us. She walked directly up to me without saying a word to my parents or myself. She put her hands on my shoulders and she looked into my eyes. I'm pretty sure she looked into my soul with that gaze that she has. But I think that was the first time that somebody recognized the hurt behind my eyes, behind the mask that I was wearing constantly. And we look at each other for maybe 5, 10 seconds. And then she brought me in for a hug. And during that hug is the first time in a long time that I felt like everything might be okay, that there was someone outside of my parents who actually cared about me. Um, I say this to people all the time, and sometimes they don't understand what I mean when I say I may not have gotten clean at Recovery High School, but I got clean because of Recovery High School. I could talk about my experiences at Recovery High School for hours, but I will spare you. But their approach was simple in my eyes. Love these students up until they love themselves. Assist them in identifying underlying reasons for their substance use rather than just focusing on removing the drug. Arm these students with useful coping mechanisms, with setting boundaries, with facing their issues head on rather than running away from them or numbing ourselves. Educate the students on these substances and the harmful side effects rather than just avoiding the conversation because it's uncomfortable. And I have seen this approach work literal miracles. While on the flip side, I've seen the opposite approach, which I described earlier, literally kill people. So I feel like I can honestly say that each and every educational facility needs to adopt at least a piece of what Recovery High School does. And I don't necessarily mean drug test all the students or have them attend AA or NA meetings. I mean, there needs to be open and honest conversations about substance use disorders, about mental health, about behavioral issues, and the differences between them. And I don't believe it's just taking the Mr. Mackey approach of preaching drugs are bad. It's about having the uncomfortable conversations about how students are truly feeling without the fear of being judgment or being bullied. It's about being able, it's about having a conversation with them about what's going on in their home lives. It's about having a conversation that we're having today about the differences between use and misuse and identifying what the true risk factors are and what the true gateway to drug misuse really is. Because not every adolescent that smokes pot or drinks a beer will become a drug addict or an alcoholic. Because we learned through decades of research that becoming an addict or an alcoholic isn't usually just by chance or because you have bad morals. If smoking pot or drinking was the true gateway to drug misuse, then I feel like this would be a much easier problem to curb. It's about identifying what I believe to be the true gateway drug or the gateway to drugs. And it's things like abuse, things like neglect, things like trauma, things like bullying, peer pressure, which in my opinion means that these are all areas that need to be focused on and addressed in schools. Just like we focused on those things at Recovery High School on a daily basis. And because of those talks that we had and the groups that we had at that high school, when I was finally ready to enter into recovery, I had a much better and a much stronger foundation than most people did. And it's because it's because Recovery High School became a home to me. The students became family to me, and the staff all became mentors for me. Mainly because no matter what, they never stopped seeing the good in me, and they never didn't see what I had to offer the world. Even when everybody else in my life told me that my life was already over and that I should just give up, they enabled me to deal with life on life's terms. They taught me how to deal with my emotions in a healthy way and not to run from them. I could reconnect with them anytime in any place, and they would be there for me. And I have never witnessed that type of love and support from any type of school anywhere. And if they did not take that approach of showing me the and the other students the support, the love, the understanding, the guidance, I would have lost my life years ago. My parents would be without their child. My younger brother would be without his older brother to look up to, and my work would be without me as an asset. Um, but I guess the message that I want to relay is that the foundation for treatment for this disease can't be the approaches discussed earlier, the war on drugs, the just say no, the zero tolerance, the disciplined approach. The only foundation that I have seen work throughout my 8 years of active addiction and now 5 years of working in the field is using a foundation of love. And know that when a young person is actively abusing substances, it's not because they're a bad kid, or it's not because they just don't care, or because they're being rebellious just for the sake of being rebellious. There is pain there. There is hurt there. There is fear there. There are insecurities there. There's possible trauma there. And there's a call for help there. And for the students that are in school now and for future students, we need to make sure that we are better prepared for these situations that will inevitably arise. There cannot be any more willing or not willing to have a conversation because it's uncomfortable. No more sweeping it under the rug and hoping for the best. No more passing these kids off because it's just not something you want to deal with or because it's not your job. We need to face it. We need to assist one another with ways to face it and be consistent with how we treat kids, whether they come from an upper class perfect family or a kid with no real family that's in a DCF foster home, and every child that falls in between on that spectrum. Nowadays, there are so many resources that are available in the community for people and for young people with a substance use disorder, that there are no more reasons or no more excuses on why you can't be well equipped in these situations, because these situations are here. They're in every school and almost in every grade. And using that out of sight, out of mind, or disciplined approach will only farther harm these students, push them farther down the rabbit hole, and they will possibly lose their life because that approach was taken. But all in all, Recovery High School didn't just assist me in my addiction issues, right? They helped me deal with real life issues. School should no longer be just about the core classes or the GPA or about perfect attendance. The problem is here and we need to address it. And hopefully through this event, through the resources that will be shared with you, we can begin addressing it and start treating these young kids like their life actually matters, because I truly felt like my life didn't matter in that moment when I wasn't receiving the support that I felt like I deserved. And we do that from not only from not being judgmental, from by hearing a student out and meeting them where they're at, and do it with unconditional love. Because once the young person crosses that line of substance use to substance misuse, we have to be prepared, or else if we're not, they could lose their life before it even begins. So yeah, so that's my piece. Thank you again for letting me share just a piece of my story and my perspective on this topic. It means the world to see so many people engaged and a part of this, and it is truly a beautiful thing. So I will take the time this time to introduce our next panelist, the lovely Maureen Kavanaugh. She is not only an amazing person, an amazing mother, she is an amazing author as well. And I think now I can say that she is an amazing coworker as we're doing some work together over here at Aftermath Addiction Treatment Center. So I will pass it off to Maureen.
Thank you, Cody. And
Yes.
thank you so much for going after that video, because I don't think I could have held it together. I was still dry in my eyes.
Yep.
It's so real,
Yep.
and I think that's really why it's just kind of grabs you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Natick 180 Coalition and the Substance Prevention Alliance of Needham for inviting me here today. And all of you who are out there who are interested in learning more about substance use disorder. As an educator, I feel that knowledge is power, so I deeply appreciate your open minds. Like many parents who experience a child's addiction, I ask myself what I did wrong. It's natural. I certainly gave it my best. I even thought I did it right. The family vacations, the Sunday dinners, the after-school activities, long talks about the dangers of drugs and alcohol and how it impacted other family members, because I knew that addiction is linked to 50% of the time to genetics. But I found you could do all of those things and it still might not be enough. From the moment they are born, our children count on us for every aspect of life. We are inextricably intertwined out of necessity. If we don't feed them, they don't eat. We protect them and care for them. And whoever we are, we do our best. Because let's face it, this is our heart walking around outside of our bodies. Just about the time we are trying to let go and release them into the world, because that's what you're supposed to do, they begin to encounter all of the things we tried to protect them from. We do our best to instill our values and warn them of dangers, but letting them go is part of being a parent. What happens when everything you do is not enough? Let's face it, the first question people ask when they hear that a young person is involved in drug use, or when things really start to go south and the chatter about arrests and overdoses begin, is where were the parents? Well, I'm going to tell you what it might look like and what it looked like in my particular case, which after many years of working with families impacted by addiction is the norm and not the exception. So I want you to picture the perfect child. I know everyone thinks they have their children are perfect, but mine actually are. My third, I have four. Her name is Katie. Was such a sweet, easy child. The one that everybody loved. The one that everybody wanted to have over their house because she was so well behaved and so good, and such a kind person. And I find that often when I work with young people now, is the kids that really get affected by this are often the kindest, the most gentle, the ones with all the feelings, like Cody described. She volunteered, she worked, she paid her own bills, and she wanted to be a special education teacher like her mother. She graduated with honors from high school. She was adored by her family. She sang in the church choir and was never a moment's trouble except for some early signs of an eating issue, which we immediately got on, sent her to a therapist that specialized in it, and it seemed to get better. We caught her drinking once in high school, and she was the only one of all her friends, all caught drinking that night, that had any consequences. I think the whole family came and talked to her. We talked about family history, we talked about rules, and she lost privileges. Never any more trouble with her. Went away to college, and initially she wasn't happy being away, but that really was not a surprise to anybody. She was a homebody. She was the kid that went to an overnight at somebody's house and was home at 7:30. The kid that really hated overnight camp and didn't want to go after the first time. But she started to get comfortable and she even gained weight, and I took that as a good sign. I suspected that the freshman 15 might have a little something to do with beer, but I had three other kids, two older, and I'd gone through this already, and I'm sure that they all had a little too much fun in college at some point, but I was never concerned about them, and Katie gave me no reason to be concerned now. By Christmas, she was coming home less, and when she did, she seemed happy, and I thought she had finally settled in. She didn't do well with her grades in the second semester, and when she came home for the summer, she confessed she had been drinking too much, experimenting with drugs, and she had tried heroin. We went from not concerned to absolutely dumbstruck and terrified. The stigma of drug use and the perception of moral failing, the idea that families must have contributed to this somehow is what keeps people isolated. My fear of this getting out in our very small town where I both worked and lived, and her carrying this with her kept me quiet in the beginning. I didn't know where to go for direction or who to ask for direction. So I took it to the emergency room because I didn't know what else to do. They evaluated her and referred her to an outpatient program where, no surprise to anyone, she did very well. So I was naive. I thought that this was going to be like an assembly line in a factory where she went in one side of the outpatient program, she did great, and she came out fixed, new, and I wouldn't have to worry about this anymore, and she would go on and resume her life again. No help or information was offered to the family. I was terrified and really unable to entertain the idea that this could be anything other than a difficult moment in time. I was wrong. And my being wrong contributed to how the next several years played out. So looking back, as I often would over those next several years, I asked myself what I could have done differently. Where was the point where experimenting, which many teenagers do, turned into serious drug use and addiction? What would I change or do, knowing what I know now? The thing about this is, I'm still not sure, given what was available years ago, but I keep coming back to education. This is not something you should be learning about when you need to know. It's a subject you should be well versed in the hope that you never need to use the information. Many of the warning signs of early drug use are similar to that of an ordinary adolescence. So when she was a teenager and she was moody and up too late and sleeping too late, I chalked that up to being a teen. When her friends changed a bit, I assumed she was making new friends. I met them and they looked a lot like her old friends. Nothing jumped out until things got really bad. So I guess what I would have done differently is been more aware that this can happen to even a child who seems perfect. She came to me, and I thought she always would, but I underestimated the power of addiction. What followed was years of drug use, resulting in 13 overdoses that brought her to the hospital, blue and dead, entry into over 40 different treatment centers, and years and years of pain for the family. I lost a business. My health suffered, and I did things and acted in a way only a mother who was watching their child die right in front of them over and over again can understand. I received no education or assistance for the family from any of these very expensive treatment centers. In fact, as much as I asked, I received 4 meetings that included the family, all around discharge planning. I was desperate for information and got none except for what I was able to find for myself. The title of the book that I wrote is If You Love Me. And the reason the name of the book is If You Love Me is because one night she had, after many, many attempts at trying to get sober, she came home and actually she was in treatment. She was living in a sober house. She had made some really wonderful sober friends, and she had been doing well. But I didn't hear from her one night, and that was unusual for her. And then I finally heard from her friends that she had relapsed, and they were looking for her, but they couldn't find her. I was up all night worried, finally went to sleep, and at 3:00 in the morning, I heard them knocking at my door. They had found her, brought her home, and she came in the house, and she sat on my kitchen floor. She was dirty and crying and disappointed and ashamed and just so tired of living like that. And I looked at her and I said, Katie, I love you so much and you're going to die. And she looked back at me and she said, if you loved me, you'd let me die. And that's where the title of the book came from. I don't think I realized, I think I thought I knew how much pain she was in, but I definitely didn't understand it until that moment. And then I got some idea of what she was going through. We need to address the issues that bring a young person to experiment. And for those that feel it solves some problem or helps them fit in, and here's the key, we need to bring them closer. Create an atmosphere like the atmosphere at Recovery High School, where I would eventually wind up working, where they can find the answers to those issues without drugs and alcohol. My daughter was so busy being the daughter and the sister and the student everyone loved that she never learned to be there for herself. Was that what sent her to addiction? We don't really know. But I do know that if I could pinpoint those issues when she was younger, there would have been little available to help her. And I would not have known where to find services that did exist if they did. It's gotten a bit better, but not much. We need to change that. In my opinion, any drug use is a reason for concern. And I mean alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, any substance that has the potential of changing the structure and the function of a brain that doesn't develop fully until 24 is crossing the line. We don't know who won't be able to stop, and neither do our kids. I knew my daughter, and I knew she was loved and that she loved her family. It was that, looking at her, knowing her, and never imagining that this could happen, that kept me from seeing the drug use earlier, thinking that we didn't have to worry after the first attempt at treatment because she had come to me, and I thought she always would. Knowing who she was is also what allowed me to never give up hope and never cut her off or let her hit that proverbial rock bottom that people talk about. Rock bottom always has a basement. My belief is that rock bottom is dead, and I wasn't willing to go there. People that battle this disease are some of the bravest people I know. And I was proud at every attempt at sobriety and hopeful each time she tried again, because I knew far too many people by then that had lost children, and I cherished every minute she was still here. I was watching the news this weekend, and Hunter Biden, the president's son, was on CBS talking about his experience with addiction. And whatever your politics are, he said something that really stuck with me. I don't know of a force more powerful than my family's love, he said, except addiction. Had I heard him say that a decade ago, I'm not sure I would have understood. But I am here to tell you that you cannot underestimate the power of drugs and alcohol. We must stop shaming and stigmatizing and blaming and punishing our children who get caught up in this, but also the families of these children, so that they can feel comfortable searching for help, just like they would any other disease. Had the education and resources been available earlier, my family might not have had to go through all we did. We must bring substance use disorder out into the open. There's a wonderful quote by Desmond Tutu that states, there comes a point when we need to stop pulling people out of the river, and we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And I think that is so true. But when they do fall in, we need to be pulling them out together. We need to do this as a community so that no one ever feels that like they are walking a path alone, because it can so easily be you. I do that now in many ways, but it's merely a drop in the bucket of what is needed. I created a nonprofit called Magnolia New Beginnings that has support groups online, on Facebook and on Zoom, and in various locations once COVID restrictions subside, hopefully. We support nearly 30,000 people across the country. That grew from a group of maybe 50 people in Massachusetts that were trying to figure out what to do. I train clinicians now and those who work with families on what families impacted by addiction need to know and how they need to hear it. And I work one-on-one with families to educate them and help them support their loved ones. And what I hear over and over again is my story. It's the same story over and over again. People that love their children terribly, desperately, and don't know what to do. I do all of this because the pain that my family went through and my daughter endured cannot be for nothing. It can't just be pain. I have been incredibly lucky, and my sweet girl has nearly 4 years of sobriety. She is one of the people caring for your loved ones that with COVID at her job at a local hospital. She returned to school, bought a new car recently, and has her own apartment. We count our blessings every day because we are all too aware of how we were blindsided by the seeming impossibility of her becoming addicted. And we could be just as easily that it could be her that I could be mourning instead of celebrating. We will lose approximately 8 people to overdose in the hour that we sit here tonight. Last year, the numbers were over 80,000 individuals that died of an overdose. That's a packed Gillette Stadium. Wrap your head around that. Each death affects approximately 1 to 5 people, and I think that's low in this person's circle in a life-altering way. That's a son, a daughter, a husband, a mother. Those that don't succumb to addiction are left traumatized, scarred, and changed, as are their families. The answer to this is, as I discovered, is education. We need to get out in front of this. We need to teach people that don't think they need to know, like I did, like I was. I never expected that I would need to know any of the things that I wound up needing. And we need to do this, I think, in the school system and in the communities, and take care of each other's children and take care of each other. Michelle and I are now working on together on educating communities, but I'm going to let her tell a little bit about that. I thank you for listening, and I would like to introduce my friend who it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to know, and to be able to work with her at the high school, and to be able to work with her now in doing what we're doing. Michelle Lipinski.
Wow, that was, I don't even know how to speak after both of those. I cannot do either of those justice. I want to say thank you to Needham and Natick for addressing this and trying to hit this head on. I think this is exactly what all communities across the entire country and world need to be doing, is having these conversations in this community where people are involved in it, but also extending beyond the community and beyond the school and making this a community issue. In addition to being the principal, I'm also a mother of 3. And I also I own a nonprofit called I Can Help, or Potential Connections. But I also felt so strongly about this that I ran for school board, which I was a school board member for 4 years, and now I'm on the city council. And so I do believe that there is power in your words. And I believe if you really want to push this, if you really want to try to bring your agenda to the school and to the community, you really need to come together as a voice and bring it to the city council and bring it to your school committees as well. So as Maureen was alluding to in her very mysterious ways, yes, Maureen and I have been working together for 3 years to come up with a curriculum, a comprehensive curriculum, because she has written a curriculum for families and working with families. And I've written a curriculum to work with schools and to work with community members to support people and to try to find ways in the community where there can be lifelines, where people who are struggling and where people who need support know where to go. And we can train those people, because not everybody wants to be trained. Maybe it's a firefighter, maybe it's a police officer, maybe it's an EMT, maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a custodian. We don't care. Let's hold a place where we can train people to be these lifelines for people in our community. This isn't about building more recovery high schools. It's about taking what we do that we know that works for recovery high schools and translating it into resources in your community, because that's where they should be. Children shouldn't have to leave their schools. They shouldn't have to leave their supports. They shouldn't have to leave their band. They shouldn't have to leave choir and ROTC and all of those opportunities that I can't provide because I'm such a small school. We should be able to address this in our communities, in our schools, in safer ways. So that's the kind of the training that Maureen and I we'll be working, and obviously Cody will be involved in some capacity because he's such a brilliant young man. And you know, the beauty of Cody is that, like, I want to say he framed Recovery High School as this lifeline for him, but he struggled mightily while he was at my school, and his addiction got worse. And it wasn't until after he went to Recovery High School that his mother and I, who I still keep in touch with, worked with Cody to get him the help he needs. And I think he might have been like 21 or 22. And his mother's like, why are you still calling me? And so we need to build places in our communities where even though they graduate, or even though they transition out of our services, oh no, I'll start with my program now. Okay, that we do that. Okay, so this, number one, this is a resource. This is, if anyone wants to know anything about adolescent recovery disorder treatment, this is a resource that you can look to. I think it's 50 or 60 pages, but it is a comprehensive resource where you can find a lot of information about what adolescent recovery looks like, and what causes it, what are some really good opportunities. You can go to the next slide, sorry. Since the name of this is called Where is the Line, I think it's really, really important to talk about why children become addicted. And I think Cody kind of summed it up. I really don't think I need to go long and hard into this, but I think that people don't know where that line is. You're addicted before you know you're addicted. And then it takes us as adults to be their brains, to be their prefrontal cortex, to let them know that what they're doing isn't what they think they're doing, because adolescents, they have this inflated self-image. They don't know that this isn't who they are. And so they take us as adults to be their brains. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And I think when we know what addiction crosses the line, when I talk to school systems and I give any professional development, I talk about the A's, the B's, and the C's. And the A's are, how you identify somebody who might be struggling with addiction or significant mental health disorders. The A's are attendance and academics. Their attendance is going to be, something's going to be happening with their attendance, and their academics are going to look a little bit different. The B's is behaviors. They may be coming late to class. They may be showing different behaviors that they weren't showing before. And a C is the change in how they look and a change on who they're hanging out with. If those 5 things, those 3 ABCs with those 5 reasons have all been changed, there's a pretty good chance that that person is struggling with something significant with those ABCs. So if this is coming right from that book that I just showed you. Addiction can become more important than the need to eat or sleep. Suspensions from work, athletics, the discourse or loss of privileges. I have students, and the next thing is selling or losing valuables. When a student's game, whatever game console, if they're playing video games, like, really involved in, a lot of our adolescents play video games, and that's how they connect as well. If they start losing those things, if you start noticing that things are missing from your home and things that they love to do are no longer there, they're definitely crossing a line. Obviously, court involvement is you can see if they become court involved, that's a huge line that they're crossing. You can go on to the next slide. Obviously, they might act differently. They're going to spend a lot more time alone. But this is really hard because when adolescents, this is also what typical adolescents do, right? For those of us who don't have children who are struggling with addiction, they might be spending more time in their rooms, especially in the middle of a pandemic. They might lose interest in their favorite things. So this is also, we need to really also talk about the effects of the pandemic on our adolescents right now, because they're not even in school full time. A lot of our schools here in Massachusetts haven't opened up into 5 days a week. So we don't even know if these things are happening. So why it's important to have these conversations when the children are returning into our school systems, in our communities, into our churches and synagogues, is really talk to the students about, like, hey, what are you doing for fun? How come, well, I like your haircut. Have you taken a shower in a couple of weeks? But once again, you need to notice the changes in the way they look and their behaviors and their friends, whether they're talking more or whether they're talking less. But have that conversation, have an open-ended conversation, not a yes or no conversation, not a never or always conversation. What are those things that brought you joy during the pandemic? What are those things that you struggled with? Those are not yes or no questions. And those are the questions we need to ask adolescents as we start to see them emerge back into our society. You can go to the next slide. Once again, being nervous or cranky. Okay, once again, I have 3 children, 23, 21, and 15, and that's pretty much just a side effect of being an adolescent. Changes between feeling bad and feeling good, but these are cumulatively, if they're having a lot of these at one time, these are the ones, this is the way that we can see whether or not they're crossing lines. Sleeping at strange hours, missing important appointments, having problems at work, getting fired from work, eating a lot more or a lot less than usual. Once again, eating a lot more significant, would talk a little bit more about cannabis. Eating a lot less would be a stimulant. And then people with addiction usually can't stop on their own, as I kind of alluded to earlier. When an adolescent is struggling with addiction, they really need us to not do an intervention and not have this way that we can highlight what they're doing wrong, but really come to them in a loving, kind, radically compassionate, empathetic way to highlight some of the things that we see. And so you can go on to the next slide. What is addiction? I think that the last two speakers really hit home on this. I don't think I need to hit this too hard, but we just need to keep saying, as Cody and Maureen both said very eloquently, like, this is not a moral failure. This is not a weakness. This is something that is caused because there are underlying effects, whether that's mental health, whether it's genetics, whether it's social, whether it's trauma. There's a million reasons it happens. It is not a moral issue. I go to funerals for young people who have passed away because that's what I do. And that's I've lost 24 former or current students. And when I go to these funerals, I have people that say to me, that literally look at me and say, well, I hope your students learn this lesson. Not realizing that this is only an additive. Like, this is not going to help them feel better. This is not them learning. This isn't Scared Straight. This is now adding more trauma to their existing trauma because of the world that they live in. So once again, there's no scared straight in this. This is not a moral, ethical dilemma. This is a sickness. This is an illness. You can go to the next slide. Risk factors. I think Maureen alluded to this before. There may not be, or there may be some of these. These are simply risk factors. Trouble at home, mental health problems, trouble at school, trouble with making friends. Cody was saying that there was a change in when he realized that he's more of an empathetic human being, he's more of a sensitive kid. He was really afraid of being and kids are mean. And this 49% of adolescents say that they're bullied to the point where they want to not go to school. Like, so we're not only is it just the increase in the, because of the pandemic, but people are on their phones. The typical adolescent is on their phone 8.5 hours a day. And that only increases their capacity to maybe being bullied by another person or to feeling insecure and insignificant because they don't look like the other person. Next, please. Hanging around with other people who use drugs. I mean, I hear from students all the time that, you know, your friends are going to start to disengage with you as your drug use starts to increase. And so as they start to increase, you start to find new friends who maybe are more significantly addicted. So you can look at them and be like, well, at least I'm not like that. So you're going to see a change in the people that are hanging out with them. Obviously, if you start using drugs when you're much younger, your chances of becoming addicted are much greater. And then once again, there's the genetic component. You can go on to the next slide. I think there was some, I really wanted to highlight this because Cody went to my school when weed was illegal, right? And so the thought that weed is so natural and it's so acceptable and it's so culturally pervasive for our adolescents and it's seen as a non-entity. And I also see this with alcohol. So I don't want to vilify weed without vilifying alcohol. I'm not vilifying either of them, but I do want to say that weed and alcohol are the gateway drugs. And that what we see is that the same amount of people who get addicted to alcohol also have the psychoactive addiction to marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it. So 12 to 15% of adolescents. So if you have a 1,000-person high school, you're looking at about 120 of those kids who are smoking weed, 3 to 5 times a week, are definitely changing the structure of their brains. So the reason that the way that you would know whether or not weed is impacting your young person is whether they're having a harder time in school, whether they're having a hard time remembering things, whether they're kind of tripping over themselves, or whether they're having a hard time maintaining attention. At the bottom of this slide, this is the most important part that I just got in one of the RFRs from the Department of Public Health. The US Surgeon General's in 2019 advisory raised awareness of the dangers of high potency marijuana developing brains. High potency means between 15 and 24%, which is the potency, okay? The potency back when I'm 54, back when I was young was between 7 and 10%, right? It wasn't that potent. The potency of the marijuana that we're ingesting today is much, much greater. And citing from that 2017 NISDA, 13 to 17-year-olds who reported frequent marijuana use reported also 130% greater likelihood of misusing opioids. Like, let that hit home. So kids who are frequently using a lot of marijuana, it doesn't say the amount, I'm thinking like 3 to 5 times a week, showed 130% greater likelihood of misusing opioids. That in and of itself should be on a billboard in every single high school, in every single nurse's office, and every single principal's office. That should be somewhere in every single school. So we can turn to that and say, like, that's not me saying that weed is bad, that's the reality. Next slide. Once again, weed in adolescence can have a serious impact. It is a decline in school performance. We see that students who smoke marijuana get lower grades. They have a higher dropout rate. They have an increased risk of mental health illness, and they're linked to a high range of mental health problems. Obviously, smoking and driving, it's really challenging to find whether or not they are impaired by that. But they have this, once again, they have a persona, they have this perception that weed is so innocuous that they can drive on it, they can skateboard on it, they can do all of these normal things on it, when typically a lot more injuries are happening at the emergency room because of being impaired by marijuana. And then obviously 1 in 6 teens who use marijuana do become addicted. So once again, this has become kind of one of my favorite things, and I talk about it at every single thing that I'm doing. And these are the craft screening questions that your child or somebody that, if you're doing in a high school or middle school, you do this, that's called a craft questionnaire. And there are 6 questions, and there are actually 2 questions that come before this. But if the child screens into this, these are the 6 questions that they're going to be asked whether or not that they've participated in. Have you ever ridden a car with somebody who is using? Have you used drugs to relax? Have you used drugs or alcohol alone? Do you forget things? Have your family or friends told you that you might have a problem? And number 6, have you ever gotten into trouble? And if you go to the next slide, what's beautiful about this, and I don't have the card is red and shiny, and kids love red and shiny, is this has a positive predictive value. So if you answered 3 of those, you're 70% more likely to be walking into drug abuse or dependence. If you answered 4 of those, it's 80%. 5 of those, it's 90%. And if you answer 6 of those, it's 100%. There are plenty of times where I've given this quiz to alternative schools or to classes, and people are high-fiving themselves going 6 out of 6, and they think that's a really good thing. And then I flip this over and I'm like, wow, what that's telling me is that you are 100% more likely to be abused or dependent on some type of a substance. So this, once again, should be in the back pocket of every person, every parent, every teacher, anyone who's working with adolescents, because it's not a tool where people feel judged. You seriously just hand him this piece of paper or hand him this little red card that you get from the ASAP program at Children's Hospital, and you put it on there and you say, maybe you have 3 of those, but when you get to 4, guess what? You're 80% more, like you're walking yourself into addiction. So one of these positive predictive values that takes the judgment out of whether or not we believe they may be abusing substances or maybe at risk of addiction really are going to be our best friends. And so I think that's the last of my slides, and I hope I stayed under my time. How did I do? And now back to Natick and Needham.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very powerful. And thank you to Maureen and Cody as well. I think we're going to start going through some of the questions we've received. And I know Astrid and I are going to navigate that together. But before we do, Nina, was there anything that you wanted us to add before we jump into the questions?
Nope, go for it.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions. We're going to try to group a couple under the same topic. This first one would be for Michelle, and it has to do with the Recovery High School. This person would like to know what happened to the school during the pandemic, and then somewhat related to that, we have another person that wanted to know how students get into the high school, if there's a fee or is there a free option, where it's located, and the size of enrollment. So just some general questions about it, and then also maybe how it has been operating during the pandemic. Thanks.
Sure. We opened on July 24th, and we only had to shut down when the governor shut us down at the beginning of September. So we opened up again on September 16th, and we've been open ever since. So there was a minor flood that we had to, like, believe it or not, like, if a pandemic doesn't get you a flood and locust swarming, we'll always get that. But we did have to shut down for about 4 weeks due to a flood, but we opened right back up, and we've been open ever since. So we have had our eyes on our students since last July. We've been filling those treatment beds nonstop. And as far as how our school operates right now, I just signed up our 51st student today. And so that's how big it is. And there's 5 schools. Mine is located in Beverly. There's also the Ostergeist School in Boston. There's Independence Academy that's in Brockton. There's one in Worcester, and there's one in Springfield. They all operate a little bit differently. And they're all public high schools. They do not offer transportation. Districts do not have to offer transportation due to legislative issues. But I've had students from Natick and Needham at my school in Beverly. So it's that important that people find a sober place to go and a safe place to go, that people transport their children literally 2 hours each way. And I have students from New Hampshire. So, you know, but I just want to really highlight the fact that we don't all operate the same. I would love for us to find out what we're doing well and bring it back into your districts and have this kind of emulated in your district as well. So.
Go ahead, Astrid.
Sure. Hi. So the next couple of questions are going to be for Cody to answer. One person wanted to know whether your program offers juvenile services. The person who asked the question is a psychologist at a juvenile court clinic and would like to know if your organization would be a resource for them. And then there was a second question that pertained to your own personal story and your own substance use disorder. Was it limited primarily to marijuana products, or was it more broad than that? So if you could address those 2 points, we'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the questions. So our treatment program in Wakefield Aftermath Addiction Treatment Center, it is a dual diagnosis program, but for adults ages 18 to 65. However, like I said in the beginning, I mean, this isn't just our job This isn't just our career, this is our life. So we do a lot of outside peer-to-peer work. I am a certified addictions recovery coach. And I've always tried to focus that more on adolescents just because that's where I have seen the need. So although we do not treat addiction and mental health for adolescents, our staff members that are here are always willing to try to give some sort of guidance or meet up with parents to talk to parents, meet up with the kid to talk to the student about their addiction and just try to get an idea of where they're at and how they're feeling. So even though we don't, our clients are not adolescents, most of our staff members, including myself, are more than willing to meet with you yourself, if you have a child or you're just aware of an adolescent that could use some direction or education or anything like that. Like, we are more than willing to meet with them. They can meet with us at Aftermath and we can have a conversation and we can try to provide you the resources or point you in the right direction, but really just support you regardless. If you choose to seek treatment or not, we still want to be able to be there for you, because we've all had times where the resources weren't available. And that time of somebody being willing to speak to somebody about their substance use, that window of opportunity is so small that when it arises, that we have to be ready to jump into action. So I myself, along with staff members here, are always willing to meet with addicts or alcoholics, or even people that are sort of on that line of use and misuse, regardless of age or where they're at. So the next question, just in regards to my substance use disorder. In the beginning, when I started at Recovery High School, it was mainly marijuana. And I always laugh when people say that you can't get addicted to marijuana, because me, as a student who had been expelled from a public high school, kicked out of a couple other different high schools, had lost a lot of friends, family, and trust and money and items and everything, as well as being drug tested 5 times a week at some point, Michelle, I still could not stop smoking pot. And it baffled me at the time, and I really didn't understand it completely. But I think that just kind of speaks to marijuana, or my marijuana addiction. And I wish we had that craft tool in the past, because I know I would have scored 100% on it. Maybe would have gave me a little bit of an idea of the rough time that I had coming ahead of me down the road. But it eventually progressed. The marijuana was not doing what I wanted it to do anymore. It wasn't numbing the feelings like they used to numb. It wasn't taking me out of myself like it used to. So I eventually progressed to opiates, mainly Percocet 30 milligrams for about a year. And when I couldn't afford that habit, I transitioned to a heroin addiction. Yes, my addiction was probably primarily with marijuana. I spent the most time abusing marijuana, and that's what ultimately led to my opiate addiction down the road.
We go, the mute. Thank you, Cody. This next question, I think either Maureen or Michelle might be able to help with this. Person's asking, can you talk a bit about the impact that marijuana legalization has had on your students or the teens you work with? And in what ways has it impacted your approach or your treatment or process with your students?
You want to take this, Michelle? I mean, I think that, the perception that it's okay is a problem, and that we're not really looking at the fact that it's so much stronger, that we have big, like big tobacco was involved in adding things to cigarettes. Now we have, the strength of